I'm specifically talking about evidence-based policy in a domestic setting, although many of the things that I say will have relevance to communicating with international policymakers as well. Also, I'd just like to note that this presentation is based on a forthcoming paper that I've written in collaboration with 12 other people from different disciplines, including natural and social sciences, law, political science, and philosophy. So a lot of the things that that I'll be saying in the talk today have really come about because of really deep collaborative conversations around what the issues are and how we might rectify them on the kind of science to policy communication front. So let's get started. Let me make sure I can change my slides. Yes, I can. Okay. So the need for better science communication has been the topic of discussion across wildlife and conservation sciences for many years, and you're probably all very aware of that. There are many reasons for this. So first, wildlife conservation scientists and people involved in that discipline want to see positive change, right, in the way that the natural environment and wildlife are managed. And so that's an intrinsic driver of communicating to policy. Second, as the concept of evidence-based policy has grown, so too has its use in conservation law and policy. So in recent decades, most decisions in wildlife and conservation policy shifted from personal experiences and common sense to a scientific evidence-based approach. And linking science and policy aims to make conservation wildlife actions and decisions more socially robust and better accepted. Despite this, though, researchers, especially in the natural sciences, still predominantly communicate their research findings in traditional ways. So that is through publication in peer-reviewed journals, for example. Yet research indicates that policymakers rarely gather their evidence directly from journal publications. In practice, then, there remains a substantial gap between the way that researchers publish evidence and how they write up their evidence, the considered role that journals play in knowledge dissemination, and the policymakers' method of gathering evidence. So the point of this presentation then is to go through some of the challenges faced on the evidence producers side and start to look at how they might be overcome. It should be noted, though, that there is no one right way to communicate evidence to policymakers, but there are some tips and ideas about how to have that impact, and we'll talk through some of those. So what are the main challenges? First, there is often a lack of understanding from researchers of the policy cycle and even the definition of policy itself. Evidence producers find it very difficult to write a good policy impact statement without understanding the relevant policy and where their evidence may be of use within that policy cycle. There are differences in language used, even down to the term policy itself. Policy is understood very differently by different people from different disciplines. There is a lack of interdisciplinarity outside of the natural sciences, with humanities, lawyers, political sciences often left out of the fray in research with those natural sciences, and those disciplines might be able to guide the research towards particular policy relevance in a more appropriate way. Scientists produce large volumes of very detailed material to communicate their research and their evidence, but often this cannot be understood or used by those receiving it, who often need a more pithy output. And finally, government departments can be huge, and it is often difficult to know who has the interest and or power to make a change or implement or introduce a policy related to a particular wildlife or conservation problem. How to get in contact with policymakers is also often an unknown by evidence producers. Now, I'm going to explain policy as if you all have absolutely no understanding of it. So it may be a very simplistic understanding if you do regularly work with policymakers or are one yourself. And if that's the case, you'll have to excuse my oversimplified account. So what is policy? For our purposes today, I'm going to define policy as a statement of an issue and of desired outcomes or goals with supporting information as to why this is important and relevant. What are the intended strategies and actions to achieve the goal, and how the policy actions can and should be measured. However, the word policy, as I mentioned previously, is used very differently across and within disciplines and contexts. For example, policy is given a different meaning when discussing government policy as compared to discussing a management policy or a trade policy. As such, the word policy itself is often meaningless without additional context. So if you're writing a paper or a brief and you say XYZ is relevant to policy or to conservation policy, that can be meaningless to policymakers without you giving them additional context around that relevance. This is really important, and I'll discuss this again when giving some tips a little bit later on about how to write for policy. So some examples of common context giving descriptions of policy include a political party policy or a platform or a statement, a bill to introduce legislation and legislation itself, regulations that often give more detail and specific context to legislation, operational policies that prescribe procedure, and management policies that prescribe how a given threat, issue or species is to be managed. And although every policy is different, they usually, but not always, contain some combination of the elements on this slide. So a statement of issues or the problem, that's the subject of the policy, a statement of aims or goals of the policy, a statement of philosophy or the underpinning values that contextualize the policy. For example, a description of sustainable development or the precautionary principle or the baseline value of economic development. Strategies to address the issue and the problem, the implementation aims, and metrics of success and timeline for policy review. Although that last one, although ideally should be included in all policies, is the one that's most commonly missing from policy documents. Having some understanding of how policy is made is important when ascertaining how your evidence might be fed into the process as evidence. So just as defining policy is difficult, outlining any given policy-making process is really difficult and usually an oversimplification of the process, conversations and deliberations, and the politics that are involved and go into making policy. However, a common way of simplifying the process for explanative purposes is to break it down into categories of a cycle, as I've done on the slide here. Note, though, that this cycle on the slide laps the stages of policy making over each other. And this is because policy cycles have really strong critiques due to the reality of the messy nature of policy making and the oversimplification in kind of diagrammatic representation of very complex processes with multiple pathways forward. So although policy making is often viewed as a kind of rational linear process to those sitting outside of the policy making process, it is usually anything but, and a typical policy cycle does actually not assert that policy making is rational or that it occurs outside politics or that it proceeds as a logical sequence. Rather, it's usually a contest of ideas and interests, and policymakers often view their role as identifying patterns of action and what makes sense, rather than what can be demonstrated by rigorous evaluation to have a beneficial outcome in a particular area. So policy is a process that involves movements of ideas and resources and is cyclical in that policy making does not end with a finalised policy document, but continues through to implementation, evaluation, and then review. That said, the policy cycle on the slide here serves as a simple descriptive tool to assist those outside of the process to understand some part, at least, of policy development. So the process outlined that I've just talked about on the previous slide may be undertaken by lots of different people, including several different departments, including agencies and ministries in parallel, working together in parallel, or bringing together their different perspectives and values and coming together at decision-making time, often with very divergent opinions and expert analysis based on each department's priorities. Further, different departments or groups may have responsibility over different stages of a policy cycle. But ultimately, policy making is undertaken by a broad range of actors. So they include not only public servants within and outside departments, but also interdepartmental committees, technical advisory groups, and government research organisations. Evidence is acquired from these groups, but also from lobbyists, knowledge brokers, and special interest groups. And any one of these may be able to assist in ensuring your evidence is considered during the policy-making process. But who best to approach will depend on your specific context and where in the policy-making cycle the development of that policy is. It's also really important to note that there is often a distinction between policymakers and decision makers. So policymakers do not have to be high-level bureaucrats and are often not responsible for the ultimate decision of whether a policy is adopted. Decision makers, on the other hand, are often not responsible for drafting policy, but hold decision-making power regarding whether an issue should become a policy, what type of policy it should be, and ultimately whether a drafted version of a policy gets adopted. So for research where you are identifying a policy gap, decision makers such as legislators or ministers or heads or directors of departments, or those that can reach the decision makers, may be your intended audience. Alternatively, for research that informs the effectiveness of current policy or informs or shows the necessity for required policy changes, the bureaucratic policymakers within the relevant departments are the ones that are more likely to be receptive to your evidence. Finally, it's important to note that policymakers are a very particular type of scientific audience, okay? They may or may not have a scientific background to start with. They may not understand p-values and scientific methods. They have differential abilities to find relevant science and interpret its usefulness in making decisions. And not all policymakers are interested in a particular scientific finding, and instead may be motivated by different things, such as immediate relevance and utility to meet their responsibilities to the public that they govern. So finding the right policymaker who can recognise and use your evidence and implement or amend a relevant policy is crucial to successful science policy communication. You may also want to consider whether getting your evidence in front of a policymaker will be more effectively achieved by actually going through a broker or another indirect route, such as, getting your evidence in front of IPBES or someone else that can collect a large amount of evidence and put it into a more policy-friendly communication. So how can we engage in policy as researchers? In order to do this, it's really important to know where evidence is sought during the policy process so that you can direct your research to the right place. And ultimately, this will depend on your local context and the relevant government structures in the state that you're in. And so what you really need to do is make yourself aware of the policy processes that are relevant to your research in your state or territory or your local governance area. Or, because we can't all be multidisciplinarians and be everything to everyone at the same time, you should seek advice and collaboration from outside your discipline, so with lawyers and with political scientists, to expand your base of expertise. So some areas of wildlife and conservation policymaking use evidence in a more integrated way across multiple stages of policymaking. So, for example, biosecurity science is often considered across all stages of policymaking, including in defining the issue itself and identifying and selecting policy options. Other areas will accept evidence only at particular stages. So, for example, during a process of review of a piece of environmental legislation, evidence from outside government will usually only be considered during the consultation phase, although specific evidence may be sought through contracted services, but you need to have a pre-existing relationship for that to happen. So although each governance structure will have their own idiosyncrasies, some ideas about where your evidence may be relevant can be found in the table on this slide. I won't go through it all. I think this is recorded, and Anne-Kristen can probably share the slides with you as well afterwards, but there's definitely different types of evidence that are relevant to these different stages, and understanding what type of evidence you have and where it's going to be relevant is crucial to you getting it to the right person. Oh, sorry, I just lost my slides. Give me a moment.
Yes, we can still see the, how can we, we can still see the table.
Yeah, you can see it, but it's disappeared from my screen for some reason. So,
yeah, now it's back. Yeah, it was going back and forth.
Okay, it's also, okay, I've worked out why. It's because my mouse has stopped working. So please just give me a minute to fix that.
Of course.
Sorry, always tech issues with these kinds of things, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, take a few minutes to figure it out. Otherwise, I do have the backup, obviously. So
that's okay. No, thank you. I've got it now. I've just started using the mouse on my laptop, so that'll have to do for now.
Yes.
Okay, so how can we, thank you for entertaining that little technological break. So how can you as researchers write for policy? First, as I've mentioned a number of times, you need to know and understand the law and policies that are relevant to the work that you're doing, or find someone who does, okay? So these can be local, national policies, regional policies, global policies. You need to find the person that knows them if you don't already. It becomes really challenging to point out to policymakers where the gaps are or where improvements and adjustments need to be made without this knowledge. This is not to say that you as scientists need to become intimately acquainted with a discipline that is not your own. As I've mentioned, we can't be everything to everyone at all the time. But, you know, we've done some research on this, and we've found that papers that are co-authored by scientists and experts in law, policy, or social sciences or political sciences are more likely to provide a greater policy understanding and demonstration of potential research impact. So that's something to consider in your research design. Academic institutions, if you're part of an academic institution, likely already has this expertise available to you in the form of your law or justice or political or social science department. And if their expertise is included from the initial conception of your research project, research can often be more effectively directed towards relevant policy gaps or current legal inquiry. Additionally, once the research is completed, those collaborators are likely to be able to assist with dissemination through policy advocacy, legal and policy inquiries, or developments related to the research, and provide advice as to who to distribute the evidence to within a policy maker department or institution. Additionally, we need to make sure that we include a clear and concise statement of the relevance of the research to policy. So a good policy brief or a good policy impact statement needs to exhibit at least some of the characteristics on this slide. And let me explain them a little bit because they're really important. First is specificity. Okay, we need to be specific and we need to be able to go beyond using the word policy. As I've mentioned before, using the word policy itself by itself is largely meaningless. What policy or what group of policies are you referring to? Are your findings relevant to legislation, to management plans, to risk assessments, to regulations? Is there a particular policy you are speaking to, whether that be global, national, or local? You should link your research findings to a specific policy or a policy target. So, for example, the SDGs or the CITES listings. You need to clearly express your results. So this seems like a no-brainer, but often is not. Your results need to be expressed clearly and with confidence. This is really hard for researchers because researchers often draw incomplete conclusions when trying to explain their research for impact because they are often very wary of the assumptions that they've made or understand the limits of their methodologies and findings. And so don't express a lot of confidence when talking about their findings. And this is just good scientific practice, right? But policymakers often want unequivocal statements. So there's a real difference here between how we're writing about our science and our methodologies and our findings and the way that policymakers want to hear about results. You obviously also should translate statistical findings into lay language and avoid really strong scientific jargon, but I think that should be quite obvious to everybody. You want to clearly express how your research is relevant to the specific policy. Okay, so this is the so what of your research. What is the meaning of what you have told me in your research? So while a research paper has many scientific details, a policymaker requires focused information regarding the relevance of your research to their task at hand. So why should policymakers use your results? You may link your research findings again to a policy need or a policy gap. And where feasible and relevant, identify if you're saying that there's no policy on this and there needs to be, you need to be clear in your statement of that. I want to talk quickly about generalizability. And what I mean is that your results need to or should apply to the jurisdiction or population that concerns the policymaker. Or if they don't, you need to explain how your results are generalizable to that population or jurisdiction. And you should clearly identify the relevant geographical focus in your research. You need to remain objective in your language, but offer options for solutions. based on your research findings, and be transparent in terms of your assumptions and how results were arrived at. Now, this might seem contradictory to expressing how your research is relevant to the specific policy and expressing your results, as I've mentioned before, but I'm going to come back to this in a minute. You should also identify next steps for the policymaker. The policymaker wants to be told what to do, right? Well, not, that's maybe an oversimplification. They don't want to be told what to do. They just want to be given some options for how to proceed. So when you're talking about the research, don't end with, and this is what my finding is, and this is how it's relevant to current policy. End with, what is the upshot of your research for the policymaker? What needs to happen next in policy, not in the research? Though, of course, when you're doing research, you also talk about research next steps. Finally, ensure readability. So this, again, might be clear to some people, but even the best policy impact statements may be useless to policymakers if they are buried amongst the scientific details in your results or discussion section of your paper. So speak to policymakers from the start of your research and make the policy impact easily findable for policymakers. Some of you may be in positions where you are supporting others through this process, and you may be journal editors or act as reviewers, and I want to briefly speak to you as well about this. So journal publishers and editors that do aim to speak to policymakers, and many journals do. They have in their stated aims that they are speaking to policy, or they require authors to engage in policy in some way. So those journals that do that need to be aware of the dissonance between how scientists write for publication and what policymakers need from evidence. So policymakers require simplicity and solutions. And scientific publication is typically about explaining complexity and uncertainty. Fundamentally, this results in two completely different ways of writing, and authors are often asked to make these styles compatible in one piece of writing. And sometimes that just might not be possible. And where it is attempted may lead to less than ideal communication with policymakers. So in instances where journal editors, in instances where journals aim to directly communicate with policymakers, the journal editors need to be flexible in how that is communicated, and could, for example, request authors to provide a singular policy impact statement that is published alongside the abstract of a main article so that policymakers can find it easily. Alternatively, journals could create a new form of publication. Wouldn't that be nice? That is essentially a policy brief or a white paper. And some journals do have these, but not many. And these types of publications allow researchers to utilize their own and existing science, as well as their general expertise, to set out an issue and potential evidence-based policy solutions. But if either of those options is adopted, and if you have control over this, and no matter what journals require of their authors or how you're writing for policymakers, some instruction is required. So many journals in the wildlife and conservation sciences explicitly require policy statements or some form of policy engagement. Yet journals rarely, if ever, provide any guidance to authors on how to do those things, how to write a policy statement, how to write for policy. Also, we need to be aware of the difference between advocacy and appropriate science communication. A lot of scientific readers or the science audience will often think that our science communication to policymakers is reaching into advocacy, and that's not what science is about. So sometimes reviewing or editing for policy impact will involve thinking differently about your critique on those statements. For example, short, pithy statements related directly to a policy may be in contrast with levels of uncertainty expressed in the main content of a paper. And reviewers may interpret this as advocacy instead of appropriate science communication. So a reviewer should be tasked to comment not on the generalization of findings as relevant to policy, but whether the statements made are supported by the paper overall. Now, I want to finish by adding some comments on our particular domain, because we work across sectors when we're looking at wildlife trade and the health nexus. And doing that adds an extra level of difficulty in communicating to policymakers. And that's because it's often more difficult for us to determine the policy relevant area, because it might be multiple policy relevant areas. There's often more stakeholders involved, and existing collaborations do not necessarily already exist between departments, and we might need to create space for those to happen. And part of your evidence translation then might be policy building, might be breaking those silos between the evidence collection, but also in dissemination by breaking silos within government and between government departments. This is really hard to do. And I'm just going to give you one example of where we've had success in doing this in Australian One Health research. And that is by creating a space for government officials and for policymakers to come to us to talk about what their issues are through a series of facilitated workshops. And we did this with One Health Policy in Australia, where we had lots of different academics from different disciplines and NGOs and government departments, lots of different people from government departments participate in a series of workshops to co-design a way forward for One Health Policy in Australia. And that worked really well, because the people from different departments that didn't necessarily know that they were all interested in the same thing made connections, and we were able to draft a multidisciplinary policy brief that could be directed to different departments, but told different departments how they needed to collaborate within government. And so that's one example of how you can do that. And if you can cold call people, don't be afraid as scientists to spruik your work and email policymakers out of the blue and say, hey, I'm doing this really cool thing and it's potentially relevant to your work. Would you like to come and have a chat about it? Or would you like to come to this workshop where I'm going to talk about this evidence? That's, other than getting in through already knowing people and going in through that kind of snowball approach, cold calling people is a really successful way. I've done it lots of times, and I've made lots of really great ongoing relationships with policymakers that way. So that's one example. I wanted to also allow some space for anyone else here that's had some successes in working across those policy areas and communicating evidence into policy. Allow you to provide any of your successes. And we might do that also in the question and comment time, which quite conveniently is now. So thank you very much, everybody, for your attention, and I hope that was useful to some of you in some way.
Yes, thank you so much, Katie. Well, to me, it was very interesting, very useful. I think it was a very practical example how to approach it, especially, for me, I have my background as well in public policy, but we've only kind of looked at the other end, like we've looked at public policies and then how can you integrate different stakeholders, but actually think about, okay, how do they actually, can be created with, like appropriate science communication. I think this is something that was, at least in my education, missing. So I think this is very helpful right now. So thank you so much. But yes, I think it's a great idea to maybe also hear from some of the audiences to share their stories, or if you have any questions, please raise your hand, use the chat. Yeah, we have a first hand. Yeah, Susanna Grimm, please unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you very much, Katie. This was really interesting. I'm Susanna. I work in GIZ headquarters on the One Health approach, and we have overcome some challenges internally to work multi-sectorally. But I was quite interested in the last your example, what you mentioned, how you actually came to the point where you can draft a multi-sectoral One Health policy. It's clear that there are different objectives in different sectors or of policy resource or sectors or whatever. I would like to really understand a bit better. You said you did workshops, you had different policy briefs, but this does not necessarily clarify all the potential conflicts and the mistrust between actors, etc., etc. I think this is the biggest challenge we have, not only in the context of One Health, but for every problem we have as a global community. We need this cross-sectoral understanding and trust, and I would like to understand a bit better, how did you manage to overcome? Did you manage? Did others manage in this process? What was your role, and how did they overcome those challenges to actually come to a consensus, a minimum consensus, perhaps? Thank you.
Thank you. That's such a good question, because, it's really so difficult and definitely goes beyond science communication, right? It goes beyond science communication to peace building almost, and that's diplomacy. But I think the reason I talked about the workshops that we had was because what we were able to do in those workshops, by letting everybody talk about their values and what they wanted to see in a One Health policy, was come to an overarching agreement on a value system that all departments could agree on. And so all of a sudden, we had all of these people that were coming in with their own values, and this person was concerned about economic development, and this person was concerned about wildlife conservation primarily. And instead of, this is the great thing about One Health, right? Instead of them all coming with these different perspectives, we could put them together and say, okay, here's the set of values that we all agree on. And so if we all agree on these set of values, we can build a policy document, or at least policy advice, that incorporates those values that we agree on. And that's what we did in those workshops. And we did that because we had a facilitator who worked really well at identifying what those barriers were, but also because we had me and other people that were independent in that room that were able to help identify that. And I think if you have people that have conflicting values without having those intermediaries, it's impossible, it becomes impossible to overcome.
Thanks a lot. Very helpful.
Yes, thank you. Anne Foucault, please unmute yourself and pose your question.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, I don't know, to all of you. And thank you, Katie, for this, wow, very nice presentation. I learned a lot. You clarify a lot as well, so thank you. I'm from WOA, the World Organization for Animal Health, in Bangkok, so in the Southeast Asia region. I'm going to ask you two questions. So, and sorry, maybe you touch on it already, but maybe I misunderstood, and I think it's my fault. So forgive me if you touch on this. In the process, we need to identify first an issue, right? That's usually the purpose of policy making and everything. So do you think to me it appears that it's only one direction? Is it a researcher who brings the issue, or could a policy maker or a decision maker brings to the research the issue? Because I mean, at this level, they can also identify issue by acknowledging, they can, travel and talk to people. So I wanted to know if you see the issue identification both way, like from both sides, and in that way, if it's possible or if it makes sense, do you think that to build research, do you think that when we define the research, the policy makers or the decision maker can be with the researcher for designing the method, the design of the study. Does it make sense? Has it been done before? I know they don't talk all the time the same language. I know that, but it could be a way to build a proper research that will be that we can transform into a proper, implementable policy, or as you define it. And that's true. But I remember, I don't want to name the research agency, but I was surprised once recently during a meeting with a lot of different people from, decision making and researcher. And one of the members of this research agency said, "Oh, that's the only thing I want to do is to make a very nice publication in a peer-reviewed journal. That's it." So I think now we don't want this anymore, right? What is the point to have just a publication, which is useful? Of course, it's a lot of work. Oh my God. But I think it should be, thought and designed to go further to that, right? I mean, it depends, but let me know if I'm clear or not.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, you're very clear, and these are such great questions. Yeah, and such interesting but really complex points to talk about in a few minutes, but I'll try. So in terms of issue identification, who does that? It can be anyone. It doesn't have to be, it can often be a policymaker if they have a special interest in something. Their mother might get diagnosed with a specific rare form of cancer, and so all of a sudden they want to make a policy that relates to that type of cancer. Or they might have watched a documentary on pangolin trade and how devastating it is, and want to introduce a policy on that. Often in wildlife, though, and in biosecurity in particular, it's the researchers that will go to policymakers they have a pre-existing relationship with and say, "We've discovered this new organism that's coming in on these ships," or "We've got evidence that XYZ is happening. This is an issue that needs your attention," and it will be built that way. Ideally, what we would like to see is co-design of not necessarily the issue, but the response to the issue in the research, which is perfectly what you've described. It's co-design between the policymakers who need a solution that they don't necessarily have and need evidence that they don't necessarily have, because we often have this problem where we see post-COVID where we have so much evidence that policymakers can't take it all in, and we need synthesis of that evidence. But actually, most commonly, there is no evidence for the policymakers to use. So we need co-design with the policymakers who have had an issue that they have brought up or has been brought to their attention, and where evidence is needed, co-designing that evidence with the researchers so that the researchers are giving them exactly what they need to make a policy, rather than just hoping that if you throw money at a researcher and say, "Go research this problem," that they'll come back to you with what they need. And that's more than just funding a project. It's having regular interactions and meetings on the method, the research question, the interpretation of results. True co-design of research really works best in policy making. I also wanted to quickly talk about, that meeting that you had where the academic said, "Well, all I want to do is focus on a peer-reviewed article." And this is a massive problem because of how we as academics get credit, get economy in our disciplines, right? And that is through peer review. And so sometimes you have academics like me that if we get a peer-reviewed article, then that's great, but really I want to just have this policy impact. And so how we make that happen is most important to me. But when I'm going for promotion, I can't demonstrate that impact very easily. And so, and what I'm judged on is my peer-reviewed publication. So I'm not saying that that's right. It's not right. It's actually quite wrong. And there's a lot of discourse around how that needs to be fixed. But from a policymaker's perspective, if you are co-designing this kind of stuff, it's also something to be very aware of, that you can go and take this research and get a peer-reviewed article out of it because that's what you need for your career, but you also have to give us what we need. And so I think it's nice for everyone to be aware that that's the situation we're in, as much as it sucks and shouldn't be the case.
Yes, thank you for the question. Thanks for the explanation, Katie. This was very interesting. Also, yeah, just in terms of seeing how the whole system works and, you know, how to maybe have a bit of a transformative change there. We do have two very interesting questions in the chat, so I'm going to read them out, but also please feel free to unmute yourself and just jump in if, you know, there's maybe something that you want to elaborate on. I'm going to start with Van Duk. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. Great presentation. My question is, what advice would you give to early career scientists who are interested in influencing policy?
As I mentioned in my at the end of my presentation, my advice would be to not be scared to reach out to people. You know, like we train our scientists and our academics to get their credit through publishing peer-reviewed articles, which often don't reach policymakers. Policymakers aren't reading them. And so if we as young scientists want to impact policy, we need to do it differently. We need to do something differently to what we're trained to do as academics, right? Email, cold call people. Like, it's not, if they don't respond, who cares? But what you've done is you've let them know that you're there and that you have this expertise. And so the next time something comes up, they might think of you. And it's not just a matter of, you know, having pride and or being humble and saying, oh, I can't do that. They often want to find evidence and often want to hear from experts when they're looking at particular policy issues. So this is really also a really practical thing to do. If you know what policy is relevant to your research and you know which department is in charge of that policy, then you can direct your research to the relevant person. So the first thing is to don't be afraid to share with people outside of academia. Don't be afraid to share your research, and that not just through social media. Like, often that's not going anywhere in either. You need to direct your research to people that you don't know, and I've done this plenty of times. The second thing that's so important is to, as I mentioned, and I tried to make this really clear, know your policy and know how your research is related to policy. And if you don't, get help from someone who does, because without that knowledge, you're just shooting into the dark. You don't know who you're talking to or who you should be talking to, who's interested in your message. So if you're a junior scientist or early career scientist and you're looking for help in getting policy impact, make the connections with the law department and the political science department in your university or your institution, and just co-design your research with them so that they can tell you right from the outset, oh yeah, that's a really great problem, and actually this is the policy that's not doing this very well, so we could address your research to that policy. Or actually, yeah, there's a current legal inquiry happening on this particular issue, so why don't we get your research and put a submission in there? So it's making the contacts within with the people that you know or that you have access to, and spreading out from there as well.
Yes, thanks. I love that advice. I think it's so good, like being, you know, confident and proactive and just connecting people, even if you're just planting a seed somewhere. I think it always pays off somehow through one or the other way.
That's right. And it's super scary. I know that and I understand that, but it's one of those things where the more you do it, the easier it becomes. So it's just a matter of practice.
Yes. We have another question in the chat. Barbara, I don't want to skip yours. We're going to come to that one, but maybe this one is kind of related to what we've just talked about. Because Liha is asking, what is your advice in case where we are working on an issue and advocate for it, but it's not the priorities of the decision makers? Maybe this relates a little bit what we just talked about.
Yeah. There's a couple of different things you can do, and that's get help from other disciplines to show them why it is an issue. So often if we go to policymakers and it's a matter of conservation and we say, we need to do X, Y, Z because otherwise this species is at risk of becoming threatened, they will be like, we've got other priorities that are way bigger than that, and we can't direct resources to that right now. So it's a matter of showing them why it's a bigger problem than what they first anticipate. And it might be that you need to get an economist involved and show them why the ecosystem services are, with respect to this species, or the, you know, the flow-on effect that loss of that species might have is going to be relevant down the track. Otherwise, yeah, it's really hard when the policymaker just doesn't have that priority. And it might be that you need to find a different policymaker that's not even in that area, but kind of operates parallel to it, that can have the impact to make the policy issue an issue in policy. But yeah, once you come up with that roadblock, it's a matter of either getting more evidence, trying again with someone else, or sitting back and waiting for a more appropriate time.
Yes, thank you for coming back on this. Okay, now Barbara is asking, what are your thoughts on overcoming the challenge of intense, non-fact-based lobbying efforts by well-funded special interest groups, which often drown out science-based policy support efforts?
Well, my thoughts are that it's completely necessary to get your evidence in front of policymakers when all they're hearing from is special interest groups, because they have a pre-existing relationship with the policymakers. And so this is why we need to not be scared of putting our evidence to them in a way that makes sense to them. And the reason special interest groups and lobbyists have success is because they know how to speak politics, right? And so when we're communicating our research, we need to do equally as well as explaining to policymakers in their language, in their terms, how the evidence that they're getting from other places is not the correct evidence. And it's not a matter of going through and saying their methods are flawed because of XYZ detailed scientific jargon. We need to oversimplify things. I'm making it sound like policymakers are idiots, and they're not. They just have a lot of different points of information coming in and need to be able to process things really quickly. And so special interest groups and lobby groups are really good at getting that information in a really short, pithy way. And that's what we need to do to counter it as well.
Yes, also, if you want to add on or clarify something as well from the audience, please also unmute yourself and jump in. Otherwise, yeah, no, please come in.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you, Katie, for the very interesting presentation. I also learned a lot from it. And actually, you know, we also working on health. We have a project, and I know that we also have some policy work. But you know, one of the things I think we may need to discuss a little bit more, like when we do the science to, you know, for a change in policy. And when we're looking at one issue, policy issue, for example, we need a lot of different pieces of science, not just one, you know. On science, you cannot, you know, advocate for changes or say that from this result, we need to change the policy or piece of regulations, let's say. We need the collection or the combination of different science. And this is the work I feel in reality is, you know, it seems challenging and missing, you know, because people, we do focus on one area. We just have a different piece of information from your scientific research. And so the work of combination of all these angles and results to inform a big, let's say a big policy change. So what is your advice for this work? Because I feel like it's not something like the work for the advocacy people. They need to collect all of these different, you know, scientific results to formulate a very strong evidence for the policy change. So I just wonder whether it's the work of the advocacy group, is also just a work of who should do this and how. Is there any advice for doing this better? Thank you.
Yeah. So, yeah, all such good questions. I don't know who should do this. I mean, I do this. This is what I do, but it's really, as you say, it's really complex in the One Health space, right? Because we need data from so many different points, from the wildlife points, the surveillance points, to the social points, to the conservation points. And are these trees missing from climate change for this reason? And do the wildlife have food for this reason? Are they going to move for this reason? Like, there's so many different data points to give a holistic picture of what's happening in a given disease space. So there are some people that have done this really successfully and publish a paper that puts things together succinctly, and they have a cast of thousands because they have the different data from different points. And I'm thinking of the Ebby and Peel and Rainworth paper from last year that was published in Nature on bats and hendrovirus and how that was affected by climate change in Australia. I can't remember the exact title of it, but that's an example of a group that's put together a lot of information to come up with a really holistic policy picture. Really, I think what seems to happen is that researchers think it's not their job. Policymakers want to get that information, but don't have the space or time to put it together. And both of them think that someone in the middle is going to do it and it's going to magically appear to them. So as researchers, we need to, if we want to have policy impact, and that's a different question in itself, right? Because many of us just want to do our science and publish it and let someone else deal with the communication of it. But for those of us that want to have impact, we need to be able to either bring together the people that we need to get that holistic picture, or work with someone else that knows how to do that. And so that's really hard too, because when you're not creating original evidence, it's harder to get funding, right? So if you're not doing your own empirical work, and if you're just pulling together information, that's really hard to get funding. But maybe what we need to do is build those additional projects where we're pulling the information together into our funding applications, rather than just having, thanks Andrea for putting that article, and I knew you'd know what I was talking about. But yeah, we need to build those projects into our research funding application, so that our research funding applications are showing that we're having policy impact, or that we might potentially have policy impact from the get-go, rather than just having the end point as the scientific output. But yeah, it's everybody's responsibility and no one's responsibility.
Yeah, understand. Because, you know, we, like in here, we have a working group, let's say from science to policy. And of course, as a policy maker of the decision makers, they want to have a strong evidence for your proposal in policy change. And then we have a different piece of information, but we have still not come to the point that we can make it as a holistic, you know, evidence to formulate a strong evidence changes. But thanks for your answers. Yeah, I still it's very challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, and often, like, what we find is that we don't have all of the data. We have some of the data that points to a certain conclusion, but we're not sure. And so we aren't clear in saying that that's the likely conclusion, because we're too unsure, because we don't have all the necessary data, right?
Yes.
But we actually, what we need to do is say, all the evidence points to this. We could probably get some more data, but in the meantime, we need to take precautionary steps to do this. And this is why. This is why it's important. And so again, it's that being really clear in to policymakers about what needs to happen and what the consequences could be of that not happening, because we write in a way that minimizes our own voice and maximizes the expression of our assumptions and our uncertainty. And when we're writing for policymakers, we just can't do that.
And often policymaker and decision makers are also suspicious of your findings. They say, yes. That's also one key difficulty for this work. But thanks anyway. Yeah, very clear to me.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting discussions that we're having here on blind spots in the system and stuff. We have another comment in the chat by Patricia Tehel. I don't know if you maybe want to unmute yourself and explain a little bit. I'm not sure if there's a specific question that you have, or if it's just a statement that we can share. Otherwise, I can read it out, but also please feel free to just unmute yourself. Otherwise, I can read it out. As conservation NGO, we need the science-based info to approach policymakers and decision makers, sometimes scrambling to find funds to get research to fit the agenda rather than going to a clearinghouse of existing research that can be used. So where decision makers trust the NGO to provide the info, and then she added, meaning the decision makers rely on opinion of partner NGOs. So maybe you have some thoughts on that you want to share.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a question or a statement, and if it, it's very valid, and that's one of the tactics that I've used before. We have some great NGOs here in Australia that have really close relationships with different government departments, such as Wildlife Health Australia, and you build relationships within that organisation to get your evidence through them to the relevant people, and that's also a really good approach. Yeah, that's all I think I want to say about that.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? Then maybe now is still your last chance in this space, at least, to raise your hand and post your question, use the chat. We still would have 5 minutes, but otherwise you can also reach out to the Alliance, of course, or also to Katie herself if that's okay. And then you can get in contact, and yeah, you can rewatch the talk in the members area. You can, I'm also gonna post the slides, so you can also go back, have a look at the table that was in the presentation. Yeah, I think we have another question in the chat, maybe to close the session. What areas of research do you believe are most critical for understanding and improving the science policy interface?
That's a really hard question, and I don't know if I have the answer. It depends on what the area is, what the policy is, what's needed. I think implementation science is so valuable and not centered enough in our research, in terms of, once we have a policy, how do you do it? How do you get it operational on the ground? How do you get stakeholders to comply with it? All that social science type research, that's really important, that we often miss. But again, it just really depends on the specific problem that you're looking at, as to what's needed. If it's a completely new policy, then you need to show why there needs to be a policy, and that's the base natural science evidence. So it depends on the context.
Yeah, I think it's the complexity of this, like as you said, also, once you maybe have great policy, but then how do you take the next step in really implementing it and enforcing it? Because you may have great policy, but then actually putting it into practice is then, I guess, another big topic. So yeah, great. You've posted your email address in the chat, so I guess everyone feel free to reach out to Katie if you have more questions or want to get in contact. I think other than that, big thank you from our side. This was very helpful. It was very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing this and being here, taking the time to talk to us. I have learned a lot, I hope, or I'm sure everyone else in this talk as well. Let's keep in touch. And thank you also to everyone who joined us today. We have more events coming up from the Alliance. So if you sign up for the newsletter, you will get more info there. Yes, and then I wish everyone a good day. And Katie, thank you so much. I think you're off now for today, as it's already quite late in Brisbane. So enjoy your evening. Thank you so much for being here with us. And
Thanks, everyone.
yes, thank you. And enjoy the rest of your day, evening, wherever you are. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Do you want me to leave, Anne Kristen, or do you want to follow up with me?
No, you can stay. We can have a little, let me